Everyone remembers Martin Lawrence, the comedian, but nobody talks about what happened on February 19, 1994. That was the night NBC banned him. Not for a fight, not for drugs. For 3 minutes of live television that made switchboards explode across America. The footage was cut. The apology was issued. The career should have been over. But Martin kept going. Until he ran into traffic screaming in 1996. Until his co-star sued him in 1997. Until he nearly died in a coma in 1999. That SNL monologue wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning. Martin Lawrence's story starts far from Hollywood and even far from America. He was born on April 16, 1965, in Frankfurt, West Germany, where his father, John Lawrence, was serving in the U.S. Air Force during the Cold War. He was the fourth of 6 children, and from the beginning, even his name carried weight. He was named Martin Fitzgerald, a name tied to Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, 2 men who stood for hope, change, and leadership. It sounded big. It sounded important. But the life waiting for him was nothing like the promise behind the name. When Martin was still young, the family left Germany and moved to Landover, Maryland, near Washington, D.C. That move should have felt like a fresh start, but instead it opened the door to a much harder life. Not long after, his parents divorced, and everything changed. His father drifted out of the picture, and the family was left to survive without him. That left Martin's mother, Clora, carrying the whole weight of the house on her back. She worked long hours as a cashier and sales clerk, doing whatever she could to keep food on the table and a roof over her children's heads. Life in the King Square projects was rough, and there was nothing soft about the world Martin grew up in. Crime was everywhere. Fights were normal, and for many kids around him, jail felt closer than any real future. Martin was small, and that meant he had to learn fast how to protect himself. He fought often, not because he wanted to be known as tough, but because that was the kind of place where weakness got tested every day. Hunger, stress, and chaos were part of normal life. At one point, he and his siblings even stole a police car just to get food. It sounds wild now, but to them, it was survival. Those years could have swallowed him whole, just like they swallowed so many others around him. But his family, especially his mother and brothers, kept pulling him back. There was struggle in that house, but there was also love. And that love kept him from going too far down the wrong road. Even in the middle of all that pressure, Martin had something special. He could make people laugh. After long shifts, when his mother came home worn out and drained, he would sit near her and start joking around, trying to get even one smile out of her. That became his first audience. That became his first test. If he could make his exhausted mother laugh after one of the hardest days of her life, then maybe he really had something. That gift was already there, quietly growing, long before the spotlight ever found him. Still, comedy was not his first dream. For a while, boxing was. As a teenager at Eleanor Roosevelt and friendly high schools, he put his energy into the ring. He trained at the Sugar Ray Leonard Boxing Center and built a promising amateur record. Boxing gave him focus, discipline, and a place to pour all the anger and pressure he had been carrying for years. For a kid from the projects, it looked like a real way out. But then, the dream cracked. An eye injury stopped his momentum, and once his mother saw the damage, she wanted that dream over. That moment hurt, because boxing had given him direction. But sometimes, the thing that falls apart is the thing that pushes you toward where you truly belong. So Martin turned back to the one thing that had always been there. He turned to laughter. At school, he was already the funny kid, the one who could turn a room around with a joke. Teachers noticed it. Friends noticed it. crowds noticed it. What began as a way to survive slowly became a path. He started trying comedy more seriously, and once he stepped onto the stage, something clicked. The sharp timing, the fast delivery, the energy, the boldness, it all made sense there. Comedy gave him a way to fight back without throwing punches. It gave him a way to turn pain into power. That path was not smooth. Early gigs were rough, and success did not come overnight. He bombed, struggled, and kept going. Then he made his way to New York, chasing bigger chances with almost nothing in his pocket. To get by, he worked regular jobs, including a Sears call center, while still grinding through comedy clubs at night. That part of the story matters because it shows how thin the line really was between failure and fame. During the day, he was just another guy earning a paycheck. At night, he was chasing a dream that most people would have called impossible. But Martin kept showing up. Then came the break that changed everything. In 1987, he appeared on Star Search. He did not walk away as the grand winner, but that hardly mattered. The audience saw him. The industry saw him. His voice, his confidence, and his raw style stood out. That one appearance pushed him into television, landing him a role on What's Happening Now. Suddenly, he was no longer just the funny guy in clubs. He was becoming a face people recognized. And once that door opened, more followed. From there, Martin moved into film, and he did it with the same energy that had made him stand out on stage. In Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, he showed he could leave an impression even in a smaller role. Then came House Party, where his connection to comedy and street energy fit perfectly. He was funny, loud, quick, and unforgettable. You could feel his momentum building. He was no longer fighting just to be seen. Now he was proving that once people saw him, they would remember him. That same force made him the perfect host for Def Comedy Jam. When he took that stage, he did not just introduce comedians. He owned the room. He brought danger, swagger, rhythm, and attitude. The show became explosive because Martin was explosive. He helped turn it into a cultural force, and in doing that, he helped launch a wave of comedians who would become stars themselves. His voice became part of the sound of the era. He was not polished, and that was exactly why people loved him. He felt alive. He felt real. He felt like somebody who had lived through enough to make every joke hit harder. Then, in 1992, he reached another level when Martin premiered on Fox. That was the moment when he stopped being just a rising comic and became a real television star. The show was loud, funny, chaotic, and full of personality, just like him. Week after week, people tuned in not only for Martin Payne, but for all the wild characters Martin Lawrence brought to life. He played the lead, but he also stretched himself into people like Shanae and Mama Payne, showing off a level of performance that made the show feel bigger than a normal sitcom. It was funny in a way that felt fresh, fast, and deeply connected to the culture. The audience did not just watch it, they lived with it. They repeated the lines, copied the attitude, and made the show part of everyday talk. But while the career was climbing, the pressure behind it was building too. That is what makes Martin Lawrence's story so gripping. The success was real, but so was the strain. He was no longer just carrying the pain of his childhood. Now, he was carrying fame, money, expectations, and non-stop work. By the mid-1990s, he was juggling television, movies, and stand-up all at once. That kind of pace can break people, especially when the old wounds underneath never really healed. Even so, the success kept growing. In 1995, Bad Boys hit theaters and changed his career again. This was the move from TV star to movie star. Paired with Will Smith, Martin brought edge, humor, and fire to the film. The movie was a hit, and it proved that he could carry major box office power. After that came even more films, and his name became one of the biggest in comedy. Blue Streak and Big Mama's House kept that run going, turning him into one of the most bankable comedy stars of his time. By then, the kid who once struggled for food in the projects was earning millions. That rise made his private struggles feel even more dramatic. From the outside, it looked like he had beaten the odds in every possible way. But inside, there were signs of serious trouble. Reports of breakdowns, emotional instability, and public incidents started to pile up. His first marriage to Patricia Southall began with promise, but it fell apart fast under the weight of fear, tension, and chaos. Court filings and public stories painted a disturbing picture of a man under intense pressure and losing control of his life. At the same time, tensions on the set of Martin grew worse, especially with co-star Tisha Campbell, whose lawsuit and eventual departure cast a dark shadow over one of the biggest sitcoms of the decade. That is what makes this part of his story so hard to look away from. Everything was happening at once. He had hit the top, but the climb had come with a cost. The fame was bigger than ever. The money was bigger than ever. But so were the cracks. Public outbursts, legal trouble, health scares, and emotional collapse all started circling him during the very years when the world thought he had it all. It felt like the pressure of years and years was finally exploding in public. Still, Martin Lawrence did not disappear. That matters. He stumbled hard, and some of those moments were deeply troubling. But he did not vanish. He kept working. He kept rebuilding. He returned to stand up with Runteldat, bringing all that pain, heat, and survival back to the stage. That return mattered because it showed that comedy was never just a career for him. It was the thing he always came back to. The same gift that helped him survive childhood was still the thing helping him survive fame. When you look at Martin Lawrence's life from the beginning, what stands out most is not just the success. It is the tension between where he came from and what he became. He was born overseas, raised in struggle, shaped by absence, pushed by survival, and held together by a mother who refused to let her children be swallowed by the world around them. He learned to fight before he learned to shine. He learned to read danger before he learned to read applause. And then somehow, through all of that, he found a way to make people laugh. By early 1994, Martin Lawrence was on a serious rise, and February 19th looked like one more huge step forward. Hosting Saturday Night Live was not just another job. It was one of those moments that told the whole industry you had crossed into a bigger space. Martin had already built his name through Def Comedy Jam and film roles, and now NBC was handing him a national stage in front of a live crowd and millions at home. For a black comedian who had built his voice by being bold, loud, and unapologetic, this was the kind of mainstream moment that could change everything. He walked onto that Studio 8H stage dressed sharp, with the lights on him and the audience ready. On paper, it should have been a victory lap. The writers had prepared material. The producers expected a controlled, polished monologue. Everything was lined up for a clean and successful night. But the second Martin got comfortable, the night started slipping away from that plan. At first, the monologue stayed close enough to safe territory. He joked with the crowd, played with the room, and teased the network in the way comics often do when they want to test the limits. Then he made the choice that changed the whole story. He stopped leaning on the script and started going off instinct. That shift happened fast, and once it happened, there was no pulling it back. Martin launched into a rough, explicit riff about women and hygiene, and the room instantly changed. Some people laughed because it was Martin, and because they were caught in the energy of the moment. Others froze because they could feel him pushing far past where network television wanted him to go. What made it worse was that this was not some harmless little detour. The language was raw, the imagery was even rougher, and the bit kept getting more graphic instead of easing off. By the time he was deep into the routine, the show had gone from risky to explosive. That danger had already been building, because before the hygiene material, Martin had tied his monologue to one of the biggest tabloid stories in America. The Lorena Bobbitt case was still fresh in people's minds, and he used it as fuel. He joked about men being afraid in bed, about body parts being cut off, about panic and humiliation, and he did it in a way that turned a national scandal into something loud, strange, and unforgettable. The story was already loaded, and Martin made it even more volatile by mixing that subject with his own fear, his own swagger, and then that wild turn into the hygiene rant. So the whole monologue started to feel unstable in real time. It was not just edgy, it felt like it could break apart at any second. That tension became the real story of the night. Once the show ended, the damage started spreading almost immediately. Complaints poured into NBC from viewers who thought the monologue had crossed every line possible. This was long before social media could turn outrage into an instant storm, which made the response even more striking. For people to flood switchboards in that era meant they were genuinely shocked. The East Coast audience had already seen it live, and by the time the network prepared the West Coast feed and future reruns, NBC knew it had a problem on its hands. The monologue was censored out. In its place came an apology card from the network, a blunt sign that even NBC understood how far the moment had gone. The full video never became part of normal rerun history. What survived was the legend of it, the transcript, and the fact that Martin had turned one hosting gig into one of the most infamous live TV moments of that decade. That backlash did not stop at one episode either. NBC moved quickly and hit him with a network ban. For a while, Martin was not just unwelcome on Saturday Night Live. He was frozen out across the network. It was a major reaction, and it came at exactly the wrong time for him. He was rising, his sitcom Martin was becoming a force on Fox, and he was building toward bigger crossover success. So what should have been a clean move into another level of fame instead became a warning label attached to his name. Martin later said the ban was real, but not permanent. And over time, he also shared that Warren Littlefield later sent him a letter apologizing and welcoming him back. Even so, the bigger truth never really changed. The damage had already been done. He never hosted SNL again, and that one monologue stayed attached to his image for decades. It became part cautionary tale, part legend, and part proof that one wild decision in front of the right audience can change the way an entire industry sees you. And yet, that was only one chapter in a much darker stretch of his life, because by 1996 the trouble around Martin no longer felt like simple controversy. It started feeling like collapse. On May 7, 1996, at the height of his fame, he ran into traffic on Ventura Boulevard in broad daylight, shouting at cars and acting so erratically that witnesses were stunned. This was not a small scene that a few people saw and forgot about. It unfolded on one of Los Angeles's busiest streets, and it quickly turned into a police matter because Martin was not only screaming and waving his arms, he also had a loaded gun on him. So in a matter of minutes, the image of a hit sitcom star and movie lead shifted into something frightening. Officers arrived, struggled to restrain him, found the weapon, and instead of taking him straight to jail, had him placed under psychiatric observation. Publicly, the explanation came wrapped in softer words, like exhaustion and dehydration. But behind that public version, a much more troubling reality was beginning to come into view. The breakdown on Ventura Boulevard did not come from nowhere. According to later divorce filings and reports from people around him, Martin had already been unraveling for months. What the public saw that afternoon was only the most visible explosion. The private version had been building much earlier. By the middle of 1995, he was reportedly showing serious signs of mental and emotional instability. There were stories of bizarre behavior, confusion, paranoia, medication issues, and a growing sense that he was not grounded. The problem was not just stress. It was not just a rough patch. It was becoming a pattern. His marriage to Patricia Southall was falling apart, and the court papers later painted a disturbing picture of late-night fights, delusional thinking, threats, and repeated refusal to stay consistent with treatment. That made the Ventura incident feel less like one bad afternoon and more like a public crack in a much deeper problem. As that picture became clearer, another pattern started standing out too. Martin seemed increasingly trapped by fear, suspicion, and the belief that danger was around him. That paranoia showed up in strange speech, in irrational anger, and in the way weapons started appearing around him. Just weeks after the Ventura Boulevard incident, airport security found another loaded gun in his bag. He reportedly carried firearms as if they were protection against threats other people could not see. To those closest to him, it looked like his world was narrowing. Fame was no longer just bringing him power and money. It was feeding isolation, pressure, and mistrust. The same man who could make a room explode with laughter could now also make people wonder whether he was safe, whether they were safe, and whether he was slipping further than anyone wanted to admit. Once those stories hit the press, the damage to his image was brutal. Headlines no longer described him as just one of the funniest men in entertainment. They began painting him as volatile, dangerous, and unstable. Then more legal trouble followed, more reports came out, and the public story around Martin got heavier with each month. Tisha Campbell's harassment lawsuit in 1997 only deepened that shift. His marriage was disintegrating. His sitcom was under strain. The industry that had once embraced his energy now had to deal with the chaos around his name. Even people who still believed in his talent had to admit that the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The wild genius of Martin Lawrence was no longer the whole story. Now there was another version running beside it, one shaped by fear, scandal, and the sense that at any moment something could go wrong again. That tension came to a head in one of the most damaging episodes of his career when Tisha Campbell filed her lawsuit in January 1997. By then, Martin was not just her co-star. He was the man at the center of a hit show they had built together, a show that had become one of the defining black sitcoms of the decade. So when she accused him of harassment, battery, verbal abuse, and threatening behavior, it was not just another celebrity headline. It shook the foundation of the show itself. Her lawsuit described a situation that had allegedly worsened over time, beginning with unwanted attention and growing into something much darker. She claimed the environment had become so bad that it affected her health and left her feeling unsafe. Once that became public, the show could never feel normal again. The fallout hit production almost immediately. Tisha refused to film scenes with Martin, which forced the series into a strange final stretch where the two leads were barely on screen together. For viewers, the chemistry that once carried the show suddenly felt broken. For producers, it became a logistical nightmare. Scenes had to be filmed separately and stitched together through editing tricks, phone conversations, split shots, and careful blocking. The show kept moving, but it no longer moved naturally. You could feel the strain in the structure. A sitcom that had once lived on rhythm, banter, and shared energy now had to work around silence and distance. That alone said a lot. Even before the case ended, the damage was already visible on screen. The legal fight only made things worse because it did not unfold in one clean direction. Tisha had walked away from the show. The studio pushed back with its own breach claims, and then her countersuit brought everything into sharper focus. Martin denied the accusations, insisted he was being used, and said he would fight back. So the story became messy, public, and deeply divided. Some people believed her immediately. Others defended him. But while the debate played out in the press, the show itself was losing the spirit that had made it special. The series managed to limp toward the finish line, and by March 1997, a settlement was reached. The details stayed private, but the outcome was clear enough. Tisha returned in a limited way for the finale, and even then she still did not shoot scenes with Martin. The separation remained in place to the very end. Years later, Martin would dismiss the lawsuit and say those things never happened. He also said he chose to walk away from the show himself. But even if he believed that version of events, the timing tells its own story. The scandal and the ending of Martin became tied together in the public mind, and that connection never fully disappeared. The lawsuit did not just hurt one season. It changed the legacy of the show. What could have gone on longer ended in tension. What could have stayed a joyful piece of television history became partly remembered through conflict. Both stars moved on and rebuilt in different ways, and over time they even appeared in public together again, which gave fans a sense of healing. Still, the shadow of that 1997 clash never truly left the story. It became one more example of how Martin's career in the 90s kept reaching huge heights, and then suddenly slamming into chaos. Then came the moment that almost killed him. In August 1999, Martin Lawrence went for a run and ended up in a coma. What makes that story so haunting is how ordinary the start sounds. A jog in the heat does not sound like the beginning of a near-death experience. But Martin was not just out for fresh air. He was pushing hard, trying to lose weight, driving his body in brutal conditions, and reportedly wearing extra layers to sweat more. The temperature outside was already dangerous, and the pressure he put on himself made it worse. When he collapsed, his body temperature had risen to a terrifying level. By the time he was found and rushed to the hospital, he was in critical condition and fighting for his life. This was not simple exhaustion. Doctors had to deal with a severe heat emergency that pushed his body into breakdown. His organs were under threat, his muscles were breaking down, and his kidneys were in danger because of the toxic strain flooding his system. He needed emergency cooling, close monitoring, and a ventilator. For days, he remained in a coma while people waited to see whether he would survive and what kind of damage would be left behind if he did. After everything that had already happened in the previous few years, the image was shocking. This was not another outburst, another arrest, or another scandal to argue over. This was life and death. The man who had once seemed unstoppable was suddenly fragile in the most literal way possible. When he finally woke up, the meaning of that moment went beyond survival. It felt like a line between one version of Martin Lawrence and another. The decade that had made him famous had also nearly swallowed him. The non-stop work, the legal problems, the emotional turmoil, the pressure to stay on top, the chaos of his public life. All of it seemed to be sitting in the background of that hospital room. Surviving the coma did not erase the earlier damage, but it did force a pause. It forced perspective. Martin had come too close to death for things to keep going exactly the same way. And from that point on, even when his career continued, There was a growing sense that he had already seen how quickly the whole machine could turn on him and how close he had come to losing everything. That is part of what makes his comeback story so compelling. He did not just bounce back from a bad review or a weak movie. He came back after scandal, public humiliation, legal trouble, mental health concerns, and a coma. And somehow, not long after nearly dying, he was back in a major film that connected with audiences again. Big Mama's House became a huge hit and reminded everyone that Martin still had real box office power. People still wanted to laugh with him. They still responded to his energy. They still showed up. That mattered because it proved his career had not been buried by the worst parts of the 90s. He could still return, still lead, still win. That comeback became even more important once the Bad Boys franchise kept growing. The first film had already helped make him a major movie star, but the later entries gave his career another long life. He was no longer just the sitcom king from the 90s or the comic with the wild personal headlines. He became part of a franchise that lasted across decades and reached a global audience. Every new Bad Boys film pulled his name back into the spotlight in a different way. Instead of old scandals leading the conversation, audiences were again talking about his comedy timing, his chemistry with Will Smith, and his staying power. That did not erase the past, but it did help reshape what people saw when they looked at him. Even so, his personal life never turned into a neat fairy tale. He built a family, had children, married again, and tried to create stability. But that side of his life stayed complicated too. There were divorces, public changes, and the same sense that peace never came easily to him. Yet as the years passed, Martin's story began to look less like a clean rise and fall and more like a long survival tale. He did not glide through Hollywood untouched. He got hit hard by fame, by his own choices, by health scares, by conflict, and by pressure. He made mistakes that damaged relationships and changed careers. He also endured moments that could have ended everything. That is why later moments carried extra weight, especially when the cast of Martin reunited in public and fans saw familiar faces together again. Those appearances meant more because people knew the history behind them. The laughter landed differently because it had been earned through years of distance, damage, and uneasy memory. Even the old SNL band, which once looked like pure disaster, became part of the larger legend around him. It was no longer just the story of a comic going too far on live TV. It became one thread in a much bigger life, a life filled with explosive highs and painful crashes.